This lesson will look at the final product of natural selection, which is called speciation and sometimes called adaptive radiation because it refers to the change in species that might occur as they adapt to various environments. Species concepts are important to understand before we look at the actual formation of new species because we need to have a working definition of what determines whether or not two different organisms actually belong to separate species. The old school method for defining species was something called the morphological species concept, and morphological species concept is totally based on the internal and external structures of organisms, what they look like overall, and how similar or how different they are. This is what's known as morphology, the actual formation of the body, and it's not used as often anymore as the other type of species concept, which is biological species concept. One reason morphological species concept is not used as often anymore is that it has some limitations. And to illustrate that, I want to first look at these two ants. This ant up here is pretty large in size and kind of a brownish color. This ant down here is much smaller in size and a black color. And if I were looking at these, I would probably say, these are different enough. They probably are different species. They look very different. Turns out that they are not only the same species, but they're actually siblings of one another. There's a wide variety of morphological differences in ants depending on what their job is within the ant colony. On the flip side, if we look at these two birds right here, these two birds were actually classified together in the same species for a long period of time, and you can see why. Same little crest on top of their heads. It's a little bit of a bluer or grayer color on the juniper bird, than on the oak. But other than that, they're really, really similar looking. And so by morphological species concept, we'd probably say these guys look like they could be the same species. And it turns out through DNA testing and reproductive testing, these should not be classified as the same species. They're not actually that genetically similar. Because of the major limitations of morphological species concept, the more commonly used species concept today is what's called biological species concept. And this is the idea that if organisms are able to successfully interbreed and create viable offspring that themselves are fertile and successfully can interbreed, then they should be classified as the same species. To give an example that you're probably familiar with of two organisms that are very similar but aren't the same species, I want to talk about the lion and the tiger because you can actually mate a lion and a tiger together and you get something that looks a little bit like this. This right here is a tigon, and you can see striping pattern from the tiger, mane from the lion. They're definitely a mixture of both species, but the tigon itself is not actually a viable offspring because it's not successful at interbreeding. Because biological species concept does rely on sexual reproduction and observing reproductive patterns between organisms, there are some major limitations associated with it. One of these is extinct organisms. We can't really observe very much about the reproductive patterns of extinct organisms, and therefore we usually use morphological species concept to try to group these organisms as best we can, acknowledging, of course, that there are those limitations on morphological species concept. The other major limitation is, of course, organisms that either don't sexually reproduce often at all or at least don't always sexually reproduce. Many plants are like that, most microorganisms, and even quite a few groups of animals don't always sexually reproduce. And if we can't observe that sexual reproduction, then it's much more difficult to come up with a biological species concept and be able to say, use reproduction as our method for determining if two organisms belong to the same species. Now that we've got a working definition of what a species is, we'll look more specifically at the major forms of speciation. And the two forms that we're going to examine are called allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is a new species formation that might be caused by geographic isolation. The term allopatric actually means, allo means different, and Patrick means homeland or fatherland. And so it's implying that this is speciation that forms when two organisms become geographically separated into two different homelands. And they would perhaps be in very different environments that could put different selective pressure on them, leading to very different adaptations being fitter in the two different populations and eventually causing divergence to the extent that two new species form. One form of geographic isolation can be accidental, in the form of accidental emigration, which you may also remember is a violation of the Hardy-Weinberg principle and the conditions needed to keep genetic equilibrium. If we have emigration, such as a migratory bird blowing off of course, or land rafts that are dispersing organisms out to islands, then we may separate a specific species as it disperses to, in the example of the land rafts, as it might disperse to different islands that have different characteristics that might select and favor certain individuals that weren't favored on the mainland. As mountain ranges form, they can actually create geographic barriers between different groups of organisms, and obviously some organisms are more impacted by this than other organisms. A group of long, free-flying birds that can go over long ranges are probably not going to be affected to the extent by mountain ranges as organisms that are smaller and have a harder time moving over those mountain ranges. Similarly, bodies of water in the form of lakes, or to the more extreme example, in the form of oceans, might actually geographically separate organisms. And one good example of this comes from plate tectonic theory, in which the supercontinent Pangaea split up into the current continents that we see today, opening up the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic Ocean is a pretty big body of water to separate and geographically isolate organisms in, say, South America and Africa. Because of their hostile nature, deserts are also a form of geographic isolation. Deserts can actually get larger and spread over time, and so as deserts might spread between two areas, they might further geographically isolate populations that would be less likely to want to travel over the hostile desert environment. Finally, a last example are the sorts of geographic isolation events that can occur when rivers change course, or in the more long-term extreme, when canyons are formed. And one of the classic examples of geographic isolation leading to allopatric speciation actually has to do with the Grand Canyon. This diagram right here shows two different squirrel types, the Harris antelope ground squirrel right here and the white-tailed antelope ground squirrel here. These two groups of squirrels were actually separated. They were part of an original population, according to genetic testing, that were eventually separated by the Colorado River when the Grand Canyon formed. And these guys live on one rim of the Grand Canyon. These guys live on the other. And as small rodents, they don't actually cross over the canyon. They don't cross down. They can't fly across the canyon from rim to rim. And they also can't swim across the Colorado River at the bottom of the canyon. So they're effectively isolated from one another, and they are currently two different species of organisms. They can no longer interbreed despite the fact that they are still pretty genetically similar. In allopatric speciation, over time living in geographically isolated areas, some differences may develop in the segregated populations. And I alluded to these a little bit. If we have a different climate or different pressures because of food or mates or for any other reason, the two different segregated populations may start to experience very different selective pressures. This can lead to a very directed type of segregation and development of differences in the form of natural or sexual selection. Natural selection I already alluded to. In the case of sexual selection, in the two different populations, it may just be that some females in one population start to prefer one sexual characteristic, and females in the other segregated population may prefer a different sexual characteristic, leading to males in each of those populations developing very different characteristics to attract mates. The change also may be less directed and more random. If a mutation arises in one of the segregated populations that isn't in the other one, then that could potentially change the overall characteristic of the population, especially if that mutation confers some sort of a benefit. You also can have genetic drift taking place, where especially if the geographic isolation is something like a small group of organisms like birds being blown off course onto islands, where you have a small population and random chance causes a change in the allele frequency of that population, and then you just get change basically because you don't have some alleles or you have a different composition of alleles than the original population. The second type of speciation that can actually occur as a result of reproductive isolation rather than geographic isolation, and this is called sympatric speciation, sim meaning the same. And so in this particular instance, the organisms may actually still be located in the same location. They may just become reproductively isolated. And this can happen either because of some things that might take place before mating that might be a barrier to reproduction, which we call prezygotic isolation. That is because pre means before, and zygotic is referring to the zygote, the fertilized egg. So this is happening before the egg is fertilized by sperm. The other type of isolation that can occur is postzygotic isolation, which happens after mating, and which can have an impact on usually the health of the offspring, the fitness of the actual offspring. In prezygotic isolation, two common types of isolation are shown below. When the mating calls or the courtship behaviors of the organisms diverge from one another, this is what's known as behavioral isolation. They're changing their behavior. If they're mating calls between two different kind of populations within a group, those mating calls start to diverge from one another, they can effectively become deaf to one another. And when they no longer can understand the mating calls of the other population, even if they might be physically capable of reproducing together, they don't hear each other. And so they stop looking to the other population for mates, and they effectively reproductively isolate each other. The other type of isolation, it's called temporal or seasonal isolation, is when mating times might diverge. And this might be the case where an original population mated in early February. And then for some reason, because the population is split into two kind of groups, and one of the groups prefers a food that's more abundant in late January, then they may start to actually mate when that food's more abundant, and the other group may start mating in late February when a different food is more abundant for them. And so just because they're not mating at the same time anymore, there won't be that overlap in mating, and they won't look to each other for potential mates. Most of the problems that are encountered in postzygotic isolation actually deal with the fitness of offspring. Because postzygotic isolation is a reproductive problem that happens after mating, it usually either involves the two organisms producing offspring that aren't fertile. Tiger and lion are a pretty good example of this. Or where many of the offspring are less reproductively successful. So they may not be totally infertile, but they're not as reproductively successful as the original organisms are. They also may end up with offspring that don't fully develop or have major genetic problems that basically have serious defects almost every single time. And so those two populations, because they're producing such unfit offspring, the offspring don't survive. And over time, they may just stop reproducing with one another altogether because of the lack of fitness.